So our Glowforge will do 3 different things. First thing it can do is cut all the way through the material. And the way I make cut lines is I use a red stroke with no fill. The laser's just going to cut wherever the red line is. The next thing it can do is called scoring, where the laser passes one time over the surface, just like cutting, but it does not cut all the way through. It simply scores or kind of scratches the surface along those paths. And so for that, I usually use green stroke with no fill. And the last thing it can do is engraving, where the laser goes back and forth really quick and it removes all the material where you have a fill. So for engraving, this is the only one where I use a fill. I use a black fill with no stroke. And technically, the darker the color, the deeper the engraving. So that's why I usually use black, because it's full engraving. If you were to use a lighter color, it would not engrave quite as deeply. Also, when working with text, you cannot send text to the Glowforge. These layers are actually shapes. If I turn on outline mode, you can see these are just shapes. I've taken my text and I have converted it to shapes. And the way you do that, once you make some text, like right now, this is still editable text. I can edit this, right? What I need to do is come up to type and say create outlines. I almost never do this though. I always use the shortcut, which is Command-Shift-O. And so when I hit Command-Shift-O for create outlines, now this is no longer editable text. I can't change the tracking and kerning. I can't change the font. This is now a shape layer. And that's what you have to do in order to send text over to the Glowforge. The one thing I forgot to do before I exported this design was I should have reflected the entire thing, because these night lights will look better when viewed if the engraving is on the back. So if you just select your entire design and come over here to your properties panel and flip it horizontally, now it's going to look backwards to us and it'll engrave backwards, but then when we view the clear acrylic, we'll view it from the other side and it'll look good. To make the artboard for your Glowforge Nightlight, we're going to use a custom size. So I just came over here to Art and Illustration, started on postcard, but now we're going to set it to inches, and we're going to say we want 6 inches by 6 inches. Your design needs to fit on an artboard that's that size. That way you're not using too much acrylic, because I don't have unlimited acrylic for everybody to use. So we've got a 6 inch by 6 inch artboard. I may actually make myself some more artboards so that I can play around and have space. I recommend doing that so you don't feel kind of limited. And I'm going to bring in a couple of shapes that I might use to illustrate a point here. One of the first things to think about is the shape that your nightlight is going to be cut into. And as far as dimensions, the dimensions of the base do matter. So to make the base, we're going to start with a rectangle, and we're just going to click once. We should have already set our units to inches, so it should be showing up as inches. And you want 2.82 inches wide by 0.625 inches tall. It's going to give us a rectangle this size. This is the size of the opening of the gap in the nightlight base. So as long as you have this on the bottom, your design will fit into the little hockey puck LED light. From here, you can pick really any shape you want for the top part of the nightlight. So if I wanted to just do something simple like an oval, right, what I would do is probably select both of these shapes and align them to make sure they're nice and centered. And then if I just overlapped them some, right, if I only overlapped them this much, that would maybe be a little bit too weak, because that would be sort of a thin spot of the acrylic and I would worry about it breaking off. So if I wanted to do this design, I would probably make sure they're overlapped a good bit, something like that. And then now if we selected both, we could either use the shape builder or we could come over here and unite them. And this would be our cut line for the outside of the acrylic, right? If I wanted to do some other kind of creative shape, like here's a cake looking thing, right? It would be the same principle. You would make you a rectangle and then you would just find a way to overlap them. For this, I might kind of just overlap the whole bottom part of the stand there. If we select them both, we can make sure they're nice and centered, and then we would hit unite, and this would be our base there. One other thing I want to show you, some very useful tools when working on these night lights. Here's one I made of my guitar headstock.
I had a picture of a guitar and I pen tooled the outline. And I knew I was going to want the cut line to be in the shape of the guitar, but then I also wanted some engraved lines. And I can quickly accomplish that once I have one path drawn. If I come up to Object, Path, there's something called Offset Path, which is going to give me another path just offset from the one that I made. So I don't have to like duplicate and try to resize this, which would be tricky. This is going to give me a perfectly spaced, nice path. And then you can play with these numbers, right? If I wanted to be closer, I could say 0.1, and then that would be a little bit closer. Maybe that looks good.
And if you used a negative number there, the path would go on the inside as opposed to the outside. So you can do either.
So now I could change this outer one to red. That would be my cut line. And then I want to engrave this black line. But there's a problem. Right now, this black line is just a single path. And remember, engraving has to have you're engraving a fill on a closed path. So right now, we couldn't really tell this to engrave. It would try to look for a fill and it wouldn't find one. So we could score this line, which would give us a very thin line. But if I want that engraved darker look, what I would do is convert this into a shape, basically. So there's two paths on either side rather than just one. And the way you would do that is you would come up to Object, Path, and then right next to the one that we just used, Offset Path, we've got Outline Stroke. And think about what that means, right? Take the stroke and outline it. Now, it's kind of hard to see because it's blue, but now I have a path going on either side. I can turn on outline mode and you'll see. So really this is like a compound path with a fill going between it. So now I could tell the Glowforge to engrave that black line and it would look the way that I want it to. Another thing to note, I actually made some mistakes on this design because I was doing some trial and error. Where I have overlapping shapes right here, you see how I have, these all started as circles, and then I did that outline stroke trick that I just showed you so that I could engrave all of these as compound paths. But there's a problem. You see where they're overlapping here? That is no good. I should have fixed that before I sent it over to Glowforge because it makes little imperfections and the Glowforge gets confused kind of when you have overlapping shapes. So all you would need to do is just come over to your Pathfinder and unite any places where you have, any places where you have overlaps here. I should have gone back through and united all of them. That way the Glowforge won't get confused and it will engrave this to look exactly as I intended.
Similar to outlining the stroke, if you were to use something like a radial repeat or a transform effect where you're putting some effect or repeater on a path, you need to expand it before you can send it to the Glowforge because the Glowforge reads paths, so you need to make sure all those paths are expanded. It's not just one path with an effect applied. When you're working on your Nightlight, I recommend saving it as an Illustrator file so that you can quickly reopen it and continue editing it. But when you're done and you're ready to turn it in on Canvas for me to actually cut it and make it, you need to save it, or export it rather, as a SVG. That is the file type that the Glowforge reads in order to read the paths and make the cutting and the scoring and the engraving. So to do that, we say File, Export, Export As, and now we need to make sure we select SVG. Export it, of course, onto your flash drive. Give it a name. I will call this Glowforge Nightlight Trial, and I'll just put it in my downloads for now because I'm about to go print it. And I'll say Export. Now on this next screen, some options will appear. Make sure responsive is not checked. If responsive is checked, then the dimensions of this design may change. And because the dimensions actually matter, so it fits in the Nightlight base, we want to make sure responsive is not checked. And everything else in there should be fine. And we'll say, okay. And now that SVG file that you just made, turn that in on Canvas, and then I can send it over to the Glowforge and cut it out for you. Here is a recap and some reminders for you to look over. I'll also put these in the description of the video down below.